There's definitely a Mariah Carey joke in there somewhere. Today we're going to talk about the force-velocity curve, the force-velocity relationship, the strength-speed continuum, whatever you want to call it. For the purpose of this video, we're going to call it the force-velocity or FV curve. Just looking at this table, we can learn a couple of things, right? We see three primary things in the table besides this axis and this little swinging line. Here we're talking about force, and that's on the left side pointing up. So the higher it goes, the more force. And then the bottom line going to the right, then we have velocity. And we want ultimately that this line goes more to the right because that means all of these qualities are improving. You also probably see a couple of names. Maximal strength, because that requires the most force. So of course, on the axis, it's at the top, the highest amount of force required. Number two is peak power. That's somewhere in the middle. It looks like a nice blend of force and velocity. And then three, speed, also known as maximum velocity, but we're going to talk about it specifically as speed because we'll get to that when we come to the physics equations. There's two other names in there, strength speed and speed strength, but those are middle grounds and they really just fall between those primary three. So we'll talk about those later. Basically, the heavier something is, or the more force one has to produce in order to move it, the lower the velocity. Like it's going to take more time to move something heavy, whereas also the inverse is true. The lighter something is, the faster you can move it or the higher the velocity. So let's explain why that is, how it works together, and how we can plan it into workouts. The first thing we need to talk about is maximal strength, and that's there up on the left, the top, with the most force. Well, force, according to physics, equals mass times acceleration. So essentially when we're thinking about strength training, anything that requires high force, that's moving something heavy, a mass, accelerating it in some way. And so we translate that in sports science as maximal strength. For example, moving a 1 rep max deadlift, the maximum weight that you can move, or a very heavy bench press at 95%, 100%. It's the maximum strength capacity of a person or an athlete. So when we train maximal strength, we always want to improve the maximum capacity, the maximal strength of that person or that athlete. Obviously, we want it to become even stronger. And there's two specific types of maximal strength. Absolute strength, which is literally just any individual's maximum capacity of strength. And the second one, relative strength, is in comparison to one's size, how strong they are. For example, if you have a 65 kilogram weightlifter and a 100 kilogram weightlifter beside each other, and they both lift 100 kilos and that's their maximum capacity, then the athlete who weighs 65 kilograms have a higher relative strength because they're lifting more weight. They are stronger than the athlete who's 100 kilograms. So an exercise prescription for this would be, for example, a 1 rep max deadlift or repetitions between 1 and 5. Weight is going to be 90 to 95%, if not 100. We're working maximally here, not submaximally, and it's going to be low velocity because, again, as we know, it's going to be low velocity when you're moving high force. Now, the example athlete for this is probably like a world record powerlifter because they can't move fast. So imagine them sprinting. They don't have very high velocity. They can't move weights, or they don't move their maximal weights at high velocity, even though they might do speed training in their off season, for example. Velocity is going to be very low in that athlete. The second one we need to talk about is peak power. Now, power equals force times velocity. So again, force we already defined. Velocity we will define when we talk about speed. Power is essentially producing the highest amount of force in the least amount of time. Here for exercise prescription, we're talking 2 to 6 repetitions, and a good exercise for this would be jump squats, for example, but you could load even more lightly if you wanted to and do more dynamic effort. We're talking about bands, we're talking about a little bit more speed work, but it's still going to be on the heavy side and velocity is going to remain low. We're working between 30 and 80%. So again, resistance is there and velocity is not. An example here might be a weightlifter. So even though Olympic lifters, for example, look like they're moving quickly, they are also moving a lot of force. So it's no maximum velocity, but it's also no maximal strength. Another type of athlete for peak power might be a thrower, a baseball player, or equestrian athletes like horses who compete. The third primary category is speed or maximum velocity. And again, we're going to call it speed for the purpose of this video. And the equation for speed is speed equals distance traveled over time. So the goal here is to move loads, which should be under 30%. The key here is low resistance, to move loads as quickly as possible or even over your maximal speed capacity, which is called super maximal speed. And we'll talk about that in another video. The exercise prescription is here, the best thing ever: sprinting, jumping, throwing, at 0 to 30% resistance. Again, key, low resistance at very high velocity. The example athletes here are, for example, 100-meter sprinters, 100-meter swimmers. And then we have two middle categories, and that is strength speed, which falls between force or maximal strength and peak power. And then we have speed and strength, which is between peak power and speed/max velocity. Now, strength speed is faster, obviously, than a maximal strength movement because it's lower on the scale, but it's not moving at maximum velocity. So here we're especially looking at Olympic lifting where we're working submaximally, still moving heavy weights, so 80 to 90%, and this is the heavy Olympic weightlifting. It's going to be fairly low to moderate velocity because it's heavy. But for speed strength, this is very low resistance and very high velocity or speed. So we're looking at lightly loaded plyometrics, for example, bars moving really quickly. We might do a bench throw, medicine ball tosses, very lightly loaded jump squats. We're talking again 1 to 6 reps of anywhere from 30 to 60% resistance. And here we want to assess what qualities are maybe a little bit weak. So for example, a sprinter, maybe they're not as strong and we need a little bit of strength. And through gaining more maximal strength, we're also looking at gaining velocity because we're trying to move this graph to the right. We're trying to move all the data points to the right in order to increase all of them. So we're looking for any weak points that we can improve in order to improve everything. So we always test and then we retest after we've trained something in order to look at, did that work? Did we get something from this? Did we get stronger and have the data points move to the right? But you have to assess and then really pick a test that actually measures what you're trying to measure. Otherwise, you're still not going to know. In a year plan, for example, our goal is to improve all of these aspects. In some capacity or another, we will train all of these aspects throughout a year, especially in soccer, especially in tennis, swimming as well. In the year plan, however, we move from general to specific. And that's to say in off season, for example, we're probably going to be doing the inverse of what we do the most of in season. So if you are a power lifter, we might do some speed work in the off season in order to improve how you're looking on this graph and to move, again, all your data points to the right, do something different, have a different kind of load, change up the volume. You're probably going to do more volume in the off-season hypertrophy work. We're putting you on a different place, training you on a different place on this graph in order to improve, again, everything. But as we get closer to the season, now we're going to be working on more specific things. So that sprinter who is lifting a lot of weights and doing a lot of repetitions in the off-season, now that 100-meter sprinter is going to get more specific, moving through dynamic motions. Absolute strength has been increased as well, and now we are working on power, moving towards maximal velocity work going into the season. So it will always get more specific coming down this curve depending on what the athlete needs the most of. I hope that was helpful. I hope you figure out how to use this and use the weight prescriptions and use the repetition prescriptions in order to train what you really think you're training, test what you think you're testing, and improve at what you're trying to improve at. So good luck. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.